Welcome to this introduction on the topic of femininity and religious belief. We're going to have a look at the image presented on the screen of the burqa and the veil and how that represents some feminist views of religion. Now, if we look at the image, we can see quite clearly that all women presented here are covered. Some feminist thinkers would argue that actually this is a good example of how women are exploited and oppressed due to religious belief. And as an example, this perhaps demonstrates how women's identity and femininity is being covered and masked and hidden by a male oppressor. They would argue that actually this is one example of how religion is patriarchal. The example that we're presented with here is how religion is used as a way of oppressing women's dress, women's identity, women's freedom. And so we would argue that this is an example of patriarchy and particularly an example of oppression through religious laws and customs. If we were to expand upon this idea of patriarchy and religion, we could look at some other examples such as sacred texts, and for example how the story of Adam and Eve is an example of patriarchy in action, Eve being the temptress of Adam and leading to the fall of man due to her inability to do as she's told. We may also look at religious organisations, for example a mosque or a Jewish place of worship, a synagogue, and how men and women are divided in the way that they're sat and segregated in these places of worship. We could also look at the hierarchy of these institutions, such as related to the image, Islam, Christianity, particularly the Catholic Church, and how we only see men in positions of authority, particularly in Christian Catholic teaching due to the succession of the followers of Christ and how they must all be male representatives of the church. Now, going back to the image that we're presented with here, this idea of oppression in Islam of laws and customs, we may also point to the example of Saudi Arabia and how women are, up until very, very recently, unable to drive. And again, this example of patriarchy enforced by male oppressors and male religious leaders is an example of women's freedom being curtailed due to the patriarchal nature of religion. However, there is a counter-argument to this, and the feminist Linda Woodhead would in fact argue that this image is not an example of patriarchy, but is instead an example of women's freedom and choice. That actually women in this picture are making a conscious decision to dress in this way in order to be judged on their personality and their minds and not on the way they dress and not on the way they look. But they choose to be identified as a group within the religious community, and this is an expression of their freedom and identity. So whilst a Western perspective, according to Woodhead, would see this as being oppressive and patriarchal, actually if we look at the meanings that these women give to these ways of dressing, that it's quite liberating in fact for them, and they produce a sense of community, a sense of identity, and in fact freedom from male oppression.